The First Sino-Japanese War from 1894 to 1895 was for a battle of influence over Korea. Korea had long been a tributary state of China, but an increasingly outward-looking Japan wanted Korea to be independent of China and open to trade with Japan. Now, note the map that I'm showing here has got modern borders, hence the border between North Korea and South Korea, but it gives you the sense of it and you get the idea. This First Sino-Japanese War is interesting from a naval perspective because this was the first significant naval engagement since the Battle of Lissa in 1866 between the Italian and Austrian fleets, and the first involving fully steam and steel warships and modern weapons between near peers. There was, of course, the Sino-French War in the previous decade, but that was a one-sided battle between ships from different eras. Since then, the Qing dynasty had received numerous modern warships, and see the Qing dynasty Navy video for more details. Well, the initial encounter of the war, the Battle of Pengdo, actually happened before the war was declared. Pengdo was a small island just off the coast of the region of Assam and about 100 kilometers southwest of Seoul. Both China and Japan had sent troops to the peninsula to protect their interests, with the significantly larger Japanese contingent taking control. The Qing government sent reinforcements, and the Japanese responded by threatening to take action if any additional troops were sent to Korea. Japanese warships received orders to use military force to prevent further Chinese troop reinforcements. The Chinese thought Japan was bluffing and decided to reinforce General Ye's forces in Assam with an additional 2,500 troops. This was done by 3 ships that sailed from Daegu to the region of Asan, a distance of 430 nautical miles, so about a day and a half steaming at 10 to 11 knots. The first 2 of these vessels, transport ships, were the Irene and Feiqing. They delivered 1,300 troops to Asan on the night of July 23-24 in 1894, under the escort of the protected cruiser Zhiyuan, about 2,400-ton cruiser built in Germany, a protected cruiser built in 1887. And she was accompanied by the torpedo gunboat Kwang Yi. There was also a small cruiser, the Weiyuan, in Chemalopo Bay near Seoul to provide some cover. Meanwhile, also on the 23rd of July, the Imperial Japanese Navy redeployed the majority of the combined fleet under the command of Vice Admiral Ito to Korean waters to prevent Chinese reinforcements from landing in Asan, and to provide support to Japanese troops on the Korean peninsula in the event of war breaking out. The fleet left Sasebo in the Nagasaki prefecture of Japan and headed for Gunsan on the west coast of Korea, which was about 200 kilometers or 120 miles south of Seoul. And from there, the Japanese could easily intervene in any conflict in Asan, while also staying in touch with their commanders in Japan by telegraph. Also on the 23rd of July, the last of the Chinese transports, the Kaohsiung, left Daegu with 1,200 Chinese troops on board, with a view of arriving in Asan on the morning of the 25th of July, 1894. And she was escorted by the gunboat Zhaoqiang. In the last stage of the voyage, they were to be joined from Asan by the protected cruiser Zhiyuan and the gunboat Kwang Yi that had escorted the previous vessels. Well, on the morning of the 25th of July, 1894, a squadron of 3 Imperial Japanese Navy protected cruisers, the Yashino and Akatsushima, both with 4 6-inch guns, and the Nanawa, which had 2 10-inch guns and 6 6-inch guns, under the command of Rear Admiral Tsuboy, arrived at Pengdo Island, which was at the south end of the bay leading to Seoul, about 100 kilometers, 60 miles to the south of Seoul. And they arrived to enforce the Japanese position. Once there, Admiral Tsuboy spotted the Chinese cruiser Yuan, and it had 2 8-inch guns and 1 6-inch gun, so it had some armor, but it was outnumbered, obviously severely, by the 3 Japanese cruisers. And the Jiang was with its escort, the torpedo gunboat Kwang Yi. And while the Japanese set an intercept course, the Chinese also spotted the Japanese coming for them, and they ran for open water, realizing they were outnumbered. The Japanese got within 2 nautical miles and opened fire. The Yoshino and the Nanawa concentrated their fire on the Jiwan, while the Akatsushima concentrated on the gunboat Kwangyi, which had been trailing about half a nautical mile behind. Well, Jiwan's conning tower was destroyed, and the forward heavy barbette guns were put out of action, and so they were at a great loss. The Jiwan crew was initially in disarray, but eventually they got it together and returned some fire, but to no effect. The situation on the gunboat Kwangyi, and the gunboats are only about 500 tons, they're quite small even though they had a 6-inch gun on them, but quite small, and its situation was much worse. The gunboat was hit below the waterline and had to beach itself. Most of the crew escaped before the raging fires destroyed the vessel. Now this would become a bit of a theme for the Sino-Japanese War naval actions. The Imperial Japanese Navy was highly disciplined, efficient and effective, whereas the Qing Dynasty Navy was slow to react, performed poorly and prone to being overwhelmed. Well, the Jiwan was spared the coup de grace by the arrival of the troopship Kaohsiung and its escort, the gunboat Zhou-Qing, on the horizon. This distracted the Japanese long enough for the captain of the Jiwan to get to some poorly charted shoals, which discouraged the Japanese from following. Instead, the Akatsushima went after the gunboat Zhou-Qing, and it was caught around midday and surrendered without a fight. The Kaohsiung, in contrast, held its course to Asan. The captain of Kaohsiung, Englishman Thomas Ryder Galsworthy, was aware that the Japanese were intercepting the Chinese vessels, but he didn't know that shots had been fired. He assumed the Japanese cruisers would not interfere with his vessel, given he was flying the British civil ensign. Well, he was relieved of this misapprehension when the Japanese cruiser Nanawa ordered the Kaohsiung to follow it to the main Japanese squadron. Captain Galsworthy protested, citing the neutrality of the British flag, but had to eventually reluctantly agree. Well, this caused mayhem on the Kaohsiung, with the Chinese soldiers demanding that Galsworthy take them back to China or that they would kill him. Well, after 4 hours of negotiation, Nanawa fired a torpedo at Kaohsiung. Although it failed to explode, Galsworthy and the British crew took advantage of the distraction to jump overboard and attempt to swim to Nanawa. The Chinese responded by opening fire on the sailors, killing them in the water, killing most of them anyway, with only Galsworthy and 2 crewmen being rescued by the Japanese. Nanawa then opened fire on Kaohsiung, sinking her and killing most of the troops on board. Approximately 300 of them, including the German military advisor, Major Konstantin von Hanneken, escaped by swimming and were rescued by various vessels, including the German gunboat Iltis, the French gunboat Lion, and the British cruiser HMS Porpoise, as well as some local fishing boats. As you can see, the Europeans were significantly involved in this conflict as advisors, observers, and arms providers. Well, as a consequence of the Battle of Pengdo, the Chinese forces ashore in Asan did not receive the reinforcements that they needed, and they were defeated by the Japanese land forces 4 days later. After that battle, war was finally declared on the 1st of August, 1894, and the land battle continued to go badly for the Chinese, leading to the major naval action of the war, the Battle of the Yalu River. The Chinese had been defeated at Pyongyang and driven back to the border with China at the Yalu River. Chinese troop reinforcements were sent by sea under a strong naval escort on the 16th of September. A convoy of 5 transport ships departed from Dalian Bay under the escort of the main force of the Beiyang fleet. You remember that the Qing Navy had been divided into 4 fleets, with the Beiyang fleet based around Beijing being the most significant. Well, this force of the Beiyang fleet was commanded by Admiral Ding, and it included the ironclad battleships Dingyuan and Zenyuan. Now, they were very substantial vessels, 7,700 tons, had 4 305mm guns, or 12-inch guns, and 14 inches of armour. Very substantial ships. And they were supported by a small coastal defence ironclad battleship, the Pingyuan. It was 2,200 tons, but it had a 10-inch gun and 8 inches of armour. And then a number of armoured and or protected cruisers. The Jingyuan, the Leiyuan, the Jingyun, the Jingyuan, and the Xingyuan. They're about 2,000 to 3,000 tons, had 8-inch guns. It also had a number of unarmoured cruisers, torpedo gunboats as well to support the fleet. As you see, quite a substantial fleet. Up against them was the Japanese fleet, and the Japanese anticipated the Chinese move, and so they had also sailed to the mouth of the Yalu River, arriving around midday on the 17th of September. The Japanese combined fleet consisted of two formations. Firstly, a flying squadron composed of 4 fast protected cruisers with 6-inch guns, the Yoshino, the Takachiyo, the Akasushima, and the Nanawa, and they were under the command of Tsuboi Kotso. And the main fleet consisting of the 6-inch guns, mostly 6-inch, there were a couple of bigger ones, but mostly 6-inch guns, and they were protected cruisers, led by the flagship Matsushima, and then the Chiyoda, the Itsushima, the Hashidat, and the ironclads Fusu and Haie, under the command of Admiral Ito. Well, foreign military advisors regarded the Beiyang fleet as superior, especially with the 2 ironclad battleships Dingyuan and Zenyuan, for which the Japanese had no counterparts. Well, zooming in a little, on this map you can see at the top at the center of the screen is Dangdong, the city of Dangdong, and it's at the mouth of the Yalu River. Pyongyang is about halfway down on the screen on the right-hand side, and Seoul on the bottom right-hand corner, just to give you a bit of context. Center left is the Chinese naval base of Dalian, and that's also where Port Arthur is, which we'll hear more about soon. And on the bottom left is Waihei, another major naval base, Chinese naval base, which will also feature soon. Well, Admiral Ding formed his fleet into a southward-facing line abreast with the strongest ships Dingyuan and Zenyuan in the centre. Obviously, my ships are not to scale, but you get the idea. 4 of his ships, the Pingyuan, the Guangbing, the Zenon, and the Zhenzong, basically the small battleship and some supporting torpedo gunboats, were still upriver with the transports and didn't arrive until partway through the battle. The Japanese arrived from the southeast in a column led by the flying squadron and followed by the main fleet. Well, Admiral Ito ordered the flying squadron to accelerate and drive past the Chinese right flank, at which point they battered the ships on the Chinese right, the Changyong and the Yangwei. The main fleet kept its slower pace, allowing it to stay broadside in front of the Chinese fleet. Well, at this point, the 4 vessels that had been with the Chinese transports arrived, drawing the attention of the flying squadron. In the Chinese line, Admiral Ding ordered his ships to change course so that they can engage more effectively, but the captain of the flagship Dingyuan neither followed the order nor passed it on. Well, the battleships resisted the heaviest bombardment as a result of their armour. However, the quick-firing Japanese guns were able to decimate the crews on their decks and throw them off their aim and their preparations. Well, the flying squadron moved behind and attacked the cruiser Xingyuan, following which several ships on the Chinese left attempted to flee north into shallow waters. The flying squadron managed to catch and sink the Xingyuan, but the other vessels escaped. The severely crippled and burning Xingyuan tried to ram Nanawa, but failed, and she sank along with her captain, Den Xinqiang. The main fleet under Admiral Ito of the Japanese Navy circled what remained of the Chinese force, sweeping the decks of the Chinese ships with their quick-firing guns and smashing their superstructures. Now, you may see a story out there that the battleship Dingyuan suffered damage from her own guns, but these days it's thought that although the firing of the main guns was quite a shock for those on the flying bridge, the damage to the ship was actually caused by Japanese gunfire. And among the casualties from that damage was Admiral Ding himself, who had his legs crushed under the wreckage, further hampering Chinese command and control. Now, the Japanese also sustained damage. The Yoshino was hit with a couple of the support vessels were put out of action. The Haie sustained serious damage because of its inferior speed. It had passed directly through the Chinese fleet rather than sweeping around it. And worst of all, the Matsushima had suffered catastrophic damage. It was most severe as its lack of armour led to two 12-inch shells tearing open the deck and igniting ready ammunition. This resulted in nearly 100 casualties. Excuse me, and forced Admiral Ito to transfer his flag to Hashida. By sunset, the Beiyang fleet's main formation was near the point of total collapse, with both wings gone. Most of the remaining ships in the port wing had fled, and all but one of the units in the starboard wing had been destroyed. The 4 units of the centre were variously damaged, and the 2 largest ships, the battleships Dingyuan and Zenyuan, were nearly out of ammunition. The remnants of the Beiyang fleet withdrew to Waihai in the south. The Japanese didn't pursue them because, although the battleships were only slightly damaged, the Japanese had no way of knowing that they suffered from a lack of ammunition. After defeating the Chinese fleet, the Japanese land forces focused on capturing China's 2 naval bases guarding the approaches to the Beijing. That was Port Arthur on the Liaodong Peninsula in the northeast, on the north, and Weihai on the Shandong Peninsula on the south. The land battle for Port Arthur saw the worst of humanity, and with the display of a mutilated Japanese soldier enraging the Japanese, who then went on a crazed wholesale slaughter of Chinese civilians. The massacre was so appalling that the world was in disbelief and presumed Chinese reports were exaggerated. No one thought that the Japanese were capable of such atrocities. I guess 50 years later it will be clear that potentially we all are. The capture of the port Weihai by the Japanese was less controversial, and the Chinese fleet finally admitted defeat and surrendered. Well, the Treaty of Shimonoseki was signed on the 17th of April 1895. China recognised the total independence of Korea and ceded the Liaodong Peninsula, Taiwan, and the Penghu Islands to Japan. Japan was subsequently persuaded to give up the Liaodong Peninsula by Russia, Germany and France in what was called the Triple Intervention, on the grounds that it being held by Japan would cause instability. Japan was handsomely paid to give it up, but felt betrayed afterward when the Russians took over control of the peninsula, a point of tension that would eventually lead to the Sino-Russian War of the 1900s. Well, from a naval perspective, there are several interesting observations from the First Sino-Japanese War. Firstly, the column formation was once again superior to the line abreast formation. The former was better for broadside attacks, but the latter allowed for ramming attacks. Early on in the ironclad era, it was thought that ramming could become a dominant tactic. But by the time of the Sino-Japanese War, the increased ranges of modern weapons, going from 1,000 yards to 3,000 yards in this conflict, had put the advantage back to the broadside. Secondly, range of fire was critical. At the Battle of the Yalu River, the Chinese actually opened the fire first at a range of 5,000 yards. But at this range, their guns were so inaccurate that they were no threat to the Japanese fleet, and they wasted a lot of ammunition that would cost them later in the battle. In contrast, the Japanese held their fire until they were within accurate range at under 3,000 yards, and their fire had a devastating effect. But being able to extend the range from the 1,000 yards that was typical in the age of sail in the early ironclad era to 3,000 yards opened up new tactical options which the Japanese fleet exploited. Now, speed of fire was also important. Although the Chinese had bigger guns on their battleships, their very slow rate of fire meant that their upper deck crews were severely restricted by the relatively rapid fire of the Japanese cruisers hosing the decks. Speed for manoeuvre was also essential. This was essentially the Japanese cruiser's Hayu's undoing, as her lack of speed resulted in her having to accept unfavourable terms of engagement. Armour also matters. The Japanese used their vessel speed and speed of fire well, but the lack of armour against the battleship's guns cost the Japanese their flagship. And lastly, in terms of the battle aspects, naval battles are not won on paper. They are won by naval personnel. Training, discipline and command and control all make a big difference, and they were seen to be the determinative factors in this battle that allowed the Japanese to defeat the superior Chinese fleet. Well, the last thing I'd like to note about the First Sino-Japanese War is that it's a reminder that interfering in other countries can have unpredictable consequences. If you recall from the video on the birth of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the wheels for this conflict were set in motion when the USA negotiated or coerced Japan, depending on your point of view, into the 1854 Convention of Kanagawa, which opened up Japan to foreign trade and diplomacy after more than 200 years of isolation. As a consequence of that, factions within Japan that were more outward-looking gained control of the government, and they set their eyes on Korea and beyond that into Manchuria, northeast China. That led to the First Sino-Japanese War, then the Second Sino-Japanese War, which then was responded to by the Americans with sanctions, which led to the bombing of Pearl Harbor. That's a pretty straight line, actually. Now, the nature of the 1854 Convention of Kanagawa and the bombing of Pearl Harbor are very different, and see the Imperial Japanese Navy birth video for the circumstances surrounding that convention and how the Americans were motivated by reasonable concerns in leading up to it. But that convention, as I said, led to the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and it's a reminder that interventions in other countries can have unpredictable consequences. Well, that's it from 150 degrees east. Thanks for joining us for this perspective, and I hope you join us again soon for more tales from longitude 150 degrees east.